3 disturbing true hidden camera horror stories. What if I told you that the camera you installed to keep you safe was showing you something you were never meant to see? Welcome back to Dark Whispers. I'm your host, and tonight, we're diving into 3 deeply disturbing true stories about hidden cameras. These aren't your typical home security tales. These are stories about people who installed cameras to protect themselves, only to discover that sometimes, the most terrifying thing isn't what breaks into your home. It's what's already inside. Before we begin, I need to warn you. These stories contain disturbing content that some viewers may find unsettling. They involve real events that happened to real people, and the footage captured is genuinely horrifying. If you're ready to hear what these cameras recorded, make sure you're somewhere safe, maybe turn on a light, and whatever you do, don't watch alone. And if you enjoy disturbing true stories like these, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode of Dark Whispers. Trust me, you'll want to be here for what's coming next. Now, let's begin with our first story. Story 1. The Nanny Cam Nightmare. Sarah Mitchell was a devoted mother of 2 from suburban Atlanta, Georgia. Like many working parents, she struggled with the decision to leave her children, Emma, age 4, and baby Tyler, just 8 months old, in someone else's care. After months of interviews and background checks, she finally hired a nanny named Rebecca Torres, a soft-spoken woman in her late 20s with impeccable references and a warm smile that put Sarah immediately at ease. For the first few weeks, everything seemed perfect. Rebecca was punctual, the children seemed happy, and Sarah's anxiety about returning to work began to fade. But then, small things started to feel off. Emma, who had always been a cheerful, talkative child, became withdrawn. She stopped running to the door when Sarah came home. Instead, she'd be sitting quietly in the corner, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit with an expression that Sarah could only describe as haunted. When Sarah asked what was wrong, Emma would just shake her head and whisper, "I'm being good. I promise I'm being good." Tyler, too, seemed different. He'd become jumpier, crying at sudden movements and sounds. Sarah mentioned it to Rebecca, who smiled sympathetically and suggested the baby might be teething or going through a developmental phase. But something in Sarah's gut told her otherwise. On the advice of her sister, Sarah decided to install a hidden camera. She bought a small, discreet nanny cam disguised as a smoke detector and placed it in the living room where the children spent most of their day. She didn't tell Rebecca. She didn't tell anyone except her husband, Mark. That night, as she lay in bed, Sarah felt almost guilty. Rebecca had given her no real reason to suspect anything. But the change in her children was undeniable. The next evening, after putting the kids to bed, Sarah sat down with her laptop and pulled up the footage from that day. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. Rebecca fed the children breakfast, played with them, read stories. Sarah began to feel foolish for doubting her. But then, around 10:30 a.m., something changed. Emma had accidentally knocked over a cup of juice. It wasn't much, just a small spill on the coffee table. But Rebecca's entire demeanor transformed in an instant. Her face, which had been pleasant and warm, became cold and rigid. She grabbed Emma's arm, roughly, violently, and jerked the little girl toward her. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth as she watched Rebecca's face fill the camera frame. The woman was screaming at Emma, her mouth twisted in rage, though the camera had no audio. Emma was crying, trying to pull away, but Rebecca's grip tightened. Then Rebecca did something that made Sarah's blood run cold. She grabbed Emma by the shoulders and shook her. Art. Emma's head snapped back and forth like a rag doll. When she finally let go, Emma collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. Rebecca stood over her, still screaming, her face red with fury. Tyler, in his bouncer seat, had started crying too. Rebecca whipped around toward the baby, and for a moment, just one terrible moment, Sarah thought she was going to strike him. Instead, Rebecca picked up Tyler's bouncer and carried it to the hallway, out of view of the camera. The baby's cries became muffled, distant. Rebecca returned alone. What happened next was perhaps the most disturbing part. Rebecca's face suddenly relaxed. She took a deep breath, smoothed her hair, and smiled. It was like watching someone flip a switch. She walked over to where Emma was still crying on the floor, knelt down, and appeared to be speaking softly to the child. Emma nodded frantically, wiping her tears. Rebecca patted her head and stood up, returning to the kitchen as if nothing had happened. Sarah was shaking so badly she could barely hold the laptop. She called Mark immediately, her voice breaking as she tried to explain what she'd seen. He rushed home from work and together they watched more of the footage. It got worse. Throughout the day, Rebecca's pattern became clear. She would be kind and patient when she thought someone might see or hear, near windows when the mailman came by, during the brief moments Mark came home for lunch. But the moment she believed she was alone with the children, the mask would slip. She would grab Emma roughly, yank her hair, squeeze her arms hard enough to leave marks. She'd scream in the child's face, her spit flying, her eyes bulging with rage. At one point, she forced Emma to stand in the corner for over 2 hours without moving. When Emma tried to shift her weight, Rebecca would storm over and push her back into position. The treatment of baby Tyler was somehow even more disturbing. Rebecca would leave him crying in his crib for extended periods, sometimes over an hour, without checking on him. Once, when Tyler's crying became particularly intense, Sarah watched in horror as Rebecca entered the nursery, picked up the baby and held him at arm's length, shaking him while screaming silently into his face. Tyler's tiny body went rigid with fear, his mouth open in a soundless wail. But perhaps the most chilling moment came late in the afternoon. Emma had wet herself, likely from fear and the fact that Rebecca hadn't allowed her a bathroom break in hours. Rebecca discovered the accident and dragged Emma to the bathroom. The camera didn't have a view of what happened in there, but Sarah could see Rebecca's shadow on the hallway wall. The shadow showed Rebecca's arm rising and falling over and over. When they emerged, Emma's face was streaked with tears and red from crying. Rebecca made the little girl clean up the mess herself, scrubbing the floor on her hands and knees while Rebecca stood over her, arms crossed, watching with that cold, dead expression. The final horrifying detail came at the end of the day. About 10 minutes before Sarah was due home, Rebecca's entire demeanor changed again. She cleaned Emma up, fixed her hair, got Tyler from his crib, and arranged both children in the living room with toys and books. She sat down between them, smiling, looking like the perfect nanny. When Sarah walked through the door, she found a scene of domestic tranquility, Rebecca playing gently with Emma while Tyler cooed in her lap. "How was your day?" Rebecca asked with that warm smile that Sarah now recognized as a mask. Sarah and Mark called the police that night. When officers arrived and viewed the footage, 2 of them had to step outside. One officer, a veteran with 20 years on the force, later told Sarah it was one of the most disturbing cases of child abuse he'd encountered, made worse by the calculated nature of Rebecca's actions and her ability to hide it so completely. Rebecca Torres was arrested the following morning. During the search of her apartment, police found something that made the case even more horrifying: journals. Pages and pages of handwritten entries detailing her hatred of children, her enjoyment of their fear, and disturbing fantasies about harming them. The entries about Emma and Tyler were particularly detailed, describing how much she loved seeing the fear in their little eyes, and how satisfying it was to break their spirits. It turned out that Rebecca's glowing references were fraudulent, created by her using fake phone numbers and email addresses. Her real name was Rebecca Montoya, and she had a history of complaints from previous families, complaints that had never escalated to formal charges because the parents had simply fired her and moved on, not wanting to put their children through an investigation. Further investigation revealed she had worked for at least 6 families before the Mitchells. Police contacted each one. 3 families reported that they'd fired Rebecca due to concerns about their children's behavior changes, but like Sarah, they'd initially had no proof. One mother broke down when police showed her some of Sarah's footage. Her daughter had exhibited the same frightened, withdrawn behavior, but they'd never been able to figure out why. The guilt of not knowing what their child had endured was overwhelming. Rebecca was charged with multiple counts of child abuse and assault. During her trial, psychiatrists testified that she displayed characteristics of sadistic personality disorder with psychopathic traits. She showed no remorse even when confronted with the video evidence. At one point, when footage of her shaking baby Tyler was played in court, several jurors were seen wiping away tears. Rebecca simply watched the screen with a blank expression. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The judge, in his closing remarks, said that the hidden camera had likely saved Emma and Tyler from escalating abuse that could have resulted in serious injury or death. He noted that Rebecca's ability to completely conceal her true nature was what made her so dangerous, and that without the video evidence she would have continued to harm children indefinitely. For Sarah and Mark, the aftermath was long and painful. Emma required years of therapy. For months she would wake up screaming from nightmares. She developed an intense fear of being left alone and would panic if Sarah was even out of sight for a moment. Tyler, though he was very young, showed signs of trauma as well. Severe anxiety around strangers and difficulty being comforted when upset. The hardest part for Sarah was the guilt. She watched that video dozens of times, torturing herself with the knowledge that her children had suffered while she was at work, trusting Rebecca. The what-ifs consumed her. What if she'd installed the camera sooner? What if she'd trusted her instincts when Emma first started acting withdrawn? What if she'd never hired Rebecca at all? Her therapist told her something that stuck with her. You did what every parent does. You tried to protect your children while also providing for them. Rebecca Torres was a predator who specifically targeted that vulnerability. This wasn't your fault. The moment you sensed something was wrong, you acted. You saved your children. Years later, Sarah shared her story publicly, hoping to warn other parents. She stressed the importance of trust your instincts. If something feels wrong with your childcare situation, investigate immediately. She also became an advocate for better background check systems and licensing requirements for in-home childcare providers. Emma and Tyler are teenagers now. Emma has no memory of those days with Rebecca, which Sarah considers both a blessing and a mystery of the human mind's ability to protect itself. Tyler, of course, was too young to remember it all. But sometimes, Sarah said, she catches Emma staring at nothing, a faraway look in her eyes, and she wonders if somewhere deep down the memory lingers. The nanny cam is still installed in their home. Sarah never removed it. She checks it every single day, even though her children are now old enough that they don't need supervision. It's become a compulsion, a security blanket. Her therapist has gently suggested this might not be healthy, that she needs to learn to let go of the fear. But Sarah can't forget what the camera showed her. She can't forget that for weeks, a monster had complete control over her children and she had no idea. She can't forget Emma's face in that footage. The terror, the confusion, the desperate attempt to be good enough to make the abuse stop. The camera stays on. Always watching. Always recording. Because Sarah Mitchell learned a terrible lesson. The people we trust with our most precious loves can sometimes be the ones we should fear the most. And sometimes, the only way to see the truth is through a lens we never wanted to look through in the first place. Story 2. The Airbnb on Evergreen Street. Marcus and Jen Chen were experienced travelers who'd stayed in dozens of Airbnbs across 3 continents. They considered themselves savvy guests who knew all the tricks, how to spot fake reviews, which amenities to prioritize, and how to avoid problematic hosts. So when they booked a charming craftsman house in Portland, Oregon for a week-long vacation in October 2019, they felt confident they'd found a gem. The property had hundreds of 5-star reviews praising the host, a woman named Diane Harmon, for her hospitality and the home's cozy atmosphere. The photos showed a beautifully decorated interior with vintage furniture, a modern kitchen, and a back deck that overlooked a garden that was apparently stunning in the spring and summer months. When Marcus and Jen arrived on a rainy Sunday afternoon, Diane met them at the door with a warm smile and fresh-baked cookies. She was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back in a bun and an almost maternal kindness in her voice. She gave them a tour of the house, pointing out where everything was, how to work the temperamental heater, and which local restaurants they absolutely had to try. "Make yourselves completely at home," Diane said as she handed over the keys. "I live just 2 blocks away, so if you need anything at all, don't hesitate to call or text me. Otherwise, the place is all yours. Enjoy your stay." The first 2 days were perfect. Marcus and Jen explored Portland's food scene, visited bookstores, and spent cozy evenings in the Airbnb watching old movies. The house had exactly the comfortable, lived-in feeling they'd been hoping for. But on the 3rd night, something happened that changed everything. Jen woke up around 2:30 a.m. to use the bathroom. As she walked down the hallway, still half asleep, she noticed something odd. There was a small red light glowing near the ceiling in the corner of the living room, a light she hadn't noticed before. She stood there for a moment trying to figure out what it was. Then her blood ran cold. It was a camera. A small black camera, partially concealed behind the decorative molding, pointed directly at the couch in the open concept living area that flowed into the kitchen. Jen's heart began to race. She immediately woke Marcus, who grabbed his phone and used the flashlight to examine the device more closely. It was definitely a camera, professional-looking, hardwired, and positioned to capture a wide view of the room. "Maybe it's just for security," Marcus said, though his voice was uncertain. "Some Airbnb hosts have cameras in common areas. They're supposed to disclose them, but..." "There was nothing in the listing about cameras," Jen interrupted, her voice shaking. "Nothing. I read through everything carefully." They spent the next hour searching the house. What they found made them sick. There were cameras everywhere. One in the second bedroom, disguised as a smoke detector. Another in the bathroom, hidden inside what looked like an air freshener mounted on the wall. One in the master bedroom, concealed inside a decorative picture frame on the dresser, pointed directly at the bed. In total, they found 7 cameras throughout the house. Some were well hidden. Others, like the one in the living room, were only concealed by the expectation that guests wouldn't look up at the corners and crown molding. Marcus immediately called the Portland police. While they waited for officers to arrive, Jen sat on the front porch, wrapped in a blanket, feeling violated in a way she'd never experienced. For the past 3 days, she and Marcus had been themselves in this house. Sleeping, changing clothes, having private conversations, being intimate. And someone had been watching it all. When the police arrived, they documented each camera and contacted Airbnb's emergency support line. An officer explained that hidden cameras in private spaces like bathrooms and bedrooms were illegal in Oregon, regardless of whether the property was an Airbnb or not. The cameras in the common areas occupied a legal gray area. They were allowed if properly disclosed, but since the listing hadn't mentioned them, that was a violation of Airbnb's policies and potentially a violation of Oregon's privacy laws. But the real horror came when the police seized the equipment and were able to access the footage. The cameras weren't just recording. They were live streaming. Detective Sarah Chin, no relation to Marcus and Jen, which made the case feel even more personal to her, was assigned to the investigation. She later told them that when the tech team accessed Diane's computer and cloud storage accounts, they found something that would lead to one of the largest hidden camera cases in Portland's history. Diane Harmon had been recording her Airbnb guests for over 4 years. The footage was extensive, thousands of hours, involving dozens of different guests. But she wasn't just keeping these recordings for herself. She was selling them. The detective found that Diane was part of an online network that traded and sold voyeur content, real footage of people in private moments, captured without their knowledge or consent. Some buyers were willing to pay premium prices for footage from bathrooms and bedrooms, particularly content that showed couples being intimate. The more the police investigated, the worse it got. Diane had been active on dark web forums, where she'd built a reputation as a reliable source for authentic amateur content. She'd sold individual clips, entire days' worth of footage, and even took requests from buyers who wanted to see specific types of people or activities. One particularly disturbing detail emerged. Diane would read through her potential guests' Airbnb profiles and messages, then selectively accept bookings based on what her clients wanted to see. Young couples, families with teenage children, solo female travelers. Each was targeted based on the fetishes and preferences of the people buying the footage. Messages recovered from her computer showed her discussing guests like they were products. "Got a young couple this weekend, very attractive, should get some good content," read one message. Another said, "Solo female, 20s, staying for 5 days. Camera and shower has perfect angle. Premium pricing for this one." When Marcus and Jen learned these details, Jen had a breakdown. The violation wasn't just that they'd been recorded, it was that their most intimate moments had been commodified, sold to strangers, distributed across the internet to be viewed over and over by people they'd never known. The footage could be anywhere now, impossible to fully erase, permanently out there in the digital void. Marcus threw himself into the investigation, working with police to identify as many victims as possible. The detective was able to trace footage of approximately 73 different guests or guest groups over the 4-year period. Many of the victims had no idea they'd been recorded until police contacted them. Some had suspected something was off during their stays but had dismissed their feelings as paranoia. One couple told police they'd felt uncomfortable during their stay and had actually placed towels over some of the vents and decorative items because they just had a feeling. They'd been right. One of the items they'd covered had been a camera. A solo female traveler who'd stayed at the house 6 months before Marcus and Jen broke down when police informed her. She'd been recovering from a divorce and had come to Portland to have some time alone to heal. "I was so vulnerable during that trip," she told detectives. "I cried, I talked to myself, I did things I would never want anyone to see." And she recorded all of it? She sold it? The case attracted national media attention. Airbnb issued a statement condemning Diane's actions and promising to implement stricter verification processes for hosts. They offered to cover therapy costs for the victims and donated a substantial sum to organizations fighting voyeurism and hidden camera crimes. But for the victims, no amount of corporate response could undo the violation. Diane Harmon was arrested and charged with multiple counts of invasion of privacy, voyeurism, and distribution of private sexual images. During her trial, prosecutors painted a picture of a calculating predator who turned her home into a sophisticated surveillance operation with the specific intent to exploit her guests for profit. Diane showed little remorse. When asked why she did it, she reportedly told her attorney, "They were in my house. I should be allowed to have cameras in my own property." Her lawyer tried to argue that the common area cameras were legal and that the others were just for security purposes, but the evidence of sales and distribution made that defense laughable. She was convicted on 47 counts and sentenced to 8 years in prison, followed by lifetime registration as a sex offender. She was also ordered to pay restitution to the victims, though the amount could never truly compensate for the psychological damage she'd caused. For Marcus and Jen, the aftermath was long and difficult. Jen developed severe anxiety around privacy and security. She couldn't stay in hotels or Airbnbs anymore without experiencing panic attacks. Even in their own home, she found herself checking for cameras, covering vents, unplugging devices. Marcus tried to be supportive, but he was dealing with his own trauma, anger, violation, and a deep sense of helplessness that footage of them existed somewhere out there forever. They both went to therapy individually and as a couple. Their therapist specialized in trauma from sexual violation and voyeurism. She explained that what they'd experienced was a form of sexual assault. Their bodies and intimate moments had been captured and distributed without consent for others' sexual gratification. The hardest part, Jen said in a later interview, was the uncertainty. "We'll never know who saw that footage. We'll never know if it's still being shared, still being sold. I could walk past someone on the street who's seen me at my most vulnerable, most intimate, and I'd never know. That feeling, it never fully goes away." Marcus became an advocate for stronger laws regarding hidden cameras and voyeurism. He worked with legislators in multiple states to push for bills that would increase penalties for this type of crime and require platforms like Airbnb to implement more rigorous host verification and property inspection processes. Their story sparked a movement within the travel community. Tech companies developed apps to help travelers detect hidden cameras. Online forums shared tips for checking rental properties. Some travelers began bringing devices that could detect wireless signals or lens reflections. But perhaps the most chilling legacy of the case was the realization it forced upon millions of travelers. Any private space you don't own could be compromised. That Airbnb, that hotel room, that vacation rental, there's no way to be 100% certain you're not being watched. Detective Sarah Chen, who led the investigation, later said the case changed how she views privacy. "We put so much of our lives online voluntarily, social media, photos, locations. But there's something fundamentally different about someone stealing your privacy, watching you when you think you're alone, capturing you when you're at your most vulnerable. It's a violation that cuts to the very core of human dignity." The house on Evergreen Street was sold to a new owner who gutted the entire interior and installed no cameras whatsoever. The property's history was disclosed, and the new owner reported that even with the renovations, they had trouble renting it. People didn't want to stay in that house, no matter how much it had changed. Marcus and Jen eventually moved to a new city, looking for a fresh start away from the memories of Portland. They still travel, but never to AIRBNBs. They stay only with friends or family, and even then, Jen brings a signal detector just in case. People think we're paranoid, Marcus said in an interview 2 years after the incident. They say we're letting it control our lives. But they don't understand, once you've learned that someone was watching you, recording you, selling you, you can't unlearn it. You can't go back to that innocent feeling of privacy. You check corners. You look for lights. You wonder. Always. The Evergreen Street case opened a dark window into how technology can be weaponized to violate the most fundamental human right, the right to privacy. It showed how a smiling host with good reviews could hide a predator. It demonstrated how our connected world, with its streaming capabilities and dark web markets, has created new avenues for exploitation that previous generations never had to fear. And it left dozens of victims with a question that haunts them still. Who else has seen me? Who else is watching? Story 3, The Baby Monitor. When Claire Henderson gave birth to her daughter Olivia in February 2018, she did what millions of new parents do. She set up a baby monitor. Not just any monitor, but a high-tech smart camera that could pan, tilt, and zoom with crystal clear night vision and a two-way audio system that let her talk to or soothe Olivia from anywhere in the house, or even when she was away. Claire was a software engineer, tech-savvy, and security-conscious. She chose a reputable brand, set up a strong password, enabled two-factor authentication, and felt confident that her daughter's nursery was safely monitored. Her husband, David, was a financial analyst who traveled frequently for work, and the camera gave them both peace of mind that they could check on Olivia anytime from anywhere. For the first 3 months, the monitor worked perfectly. Claire would check on Olivia from her home office during naps, and David would pull up the app on his phone during business trips to see his baby girl sleeping peacefully. They even gave access to Claire's mother, who lived across the country, so she could see her granddaughter whenever she wanted. It was a Tuesday night in late April when the first strange incident occurred. Claire was in the kitchen preparing bottles for the next day when she heard a sound coming from the nursery. Not Olivia crying, something else. A voice. A man's voice, speaking softly through the baby monitor's speaker. Claire's blood turned to ice. David was away on a business trip. They were alone in the house. She grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter and ran to the nursery, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She threw open the door, ready to defend her child from whatever intruder had broken into her home. But the room was empty. Just Olivia, sleeping peacefully in her crib. The monitor's camera sat on the dresser, its little light glowing green, indicating it was active. Claire checked every room in the house, looked in every closet, under every bed. Nothing. No broken windows, no forced doors, no sign of entry. She called David, who checked the camera feed from his hotel room. Everything looked normal. They convinced themselves she'd imagined it. Exhaustion from new motherhood, stress, maybe the monitor picking up interference from a neighbor's baby monitor or radio. They almost convinced themselves. But 3 nights later it happened again. This time, Claire was awake, sitting in bed reading, when she heard it clearly through the monitor on her nightstand. A man's voice singing a lullaby. The words were wrong, twisted. Hush little baby, don't you cry, somebody's watching from up high. Claire grabbed the monitor and watched the screen in horror as the camera began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it panned across the nursery, then tilted down to focus directly on Olivia's sleeping face. Then it zoomed in, closer and closer, until Olivia's peaceful features filled the entire screen. She's beautiful, the voice said through the speaker, soft and intimate. Such a beautiful little girl. Claire screamed and ran to the nursery. Again, the room was empty except for Olivia, who'd woken up crying from her mother's scream. The camera sat innocently on the dresser, now pointed at its default position. This time, Claire didn't try to rationalize it. She unplugged the monitor immediately and called the police. The responding officers took the report seriously. There had been increasing incidents of smart home devices being hacked, and advised Claire to contact the monitor's manufacturer and her internet service provider. They also suggested she contact the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, as hacking into a baby monitor could constitute stalking, computer intrusion, and depending on what the hacker did with any recorded footage, potentially production or distribution of child exploitation material. That last possibility made Claire physically ill. The next morning, she contacted the monitor company's customer support. After being passed through several departments, she finally reached a security specialist who asked her to send the device in for analysis. Claire packed it up and sent it via overnight delivery, then bought a simple audio-only monitor with no internet connectivity to replace it. But the nightmare was just beginning. 2 weeks later, Claire received a call from Detective James Morrison with the FBI's Cybercrimes Division. He asked if she could come to their office to discuss her case. The tone of his voice made it clear this wasn't optional. At the FBI office, Detective Morrison led Claire into a conference room where another agent, a woman named Sandra Liu, was setting up a laptop. The two agents exchanged a glance that Claire couldn't read, but it filled her with dread. "Ms. Henderson," Detective Morrison began, "we've been investigating a cybercriminal network that specializes in hacking internet-connected cameras, particularly baby monitors. When you reported your incident and sent in your device, the manufacturer flagged it for us because they found evidence of unauthorized access. We've been analyzing your case for the past 2 weeks, and what we found is extremely serious." Agent Liu turned the laptop screen toward Claire. "We were able to trace the IP addresses that accessed your camera without authorization. There were 3 different users who had gained access to your monitor over a period of approximately 2 months. 2 months. Claire's voice came out as a whisper. But I only heard the voice twice. They weren't always using the audio function, Detective Morrison explained gently. Most of the time they were just watching and recording. The room seemed to tilt. Claire gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. Recording? What the agents told her next was every parent's nightmare made real. The hackers had been part of the dark web community that shared access to compromised baby monitors and home security cameras. They would trade access credentials, share footage, and in some cases sell recordings to other predators. The network had been operating for over 3 years and had compromised thousands of cameras across the United States and internationally. The particular group that had accessed Claire's monitor specialized in baby and child content. They would scan for unsecured or weakly secured smart cameras, exploit vulnerabilities, gain access, and then watch. Sometimes for days or weeks before they'd use the audio function to make contact with their victims. A way of asserting control and creating fear. Agent Liu pulled up a database on her laptop. "We've identified your camera and recordings that were shared on 3 different dark web forums. The footage spans from early February, about 2 weeks after you set up the monitor, through late April when you disconnected it." Claire felt like she might vomit. What did they record? The agents exchanged another glance. Detective Morrison spoke carefully. "Most of the footage shows Olivia sleeping, being changed, feeding. But there are also recordings of you, entering and leaving the room holding Olivia, putting her down for naps. Some footage shows you, breastfeeding." The violation hit Claire like a physical blow. Her most intimate moments with her daughter, the sacred bond of caring for her child, had been stolen, watched by predators, distributed across the darkest corners of the internet. "We need to show you something else," Agent Liu said quietly. She pulled up what looked like a chat log. "This is from one of the forums where your camera's footage was shared. These are comments from the users." Claire didn't want to look, but she forced herself to read. The comments were vile. Predators discussing her baby, her body, rating and commenting on the footage like it was entertainment. Some made explicit statements about what they wanted to do. Others traded the recordings like baseball cards. One comment, highlighted by the agents, made Claire's blood run cold. "Camera 3HBG4, Claire's monitor's identifier. Mom is so careful, always checking, has no idea we've been watching for months. Kid will be good content for years if we keep access." "Years?" Claire's voice cracked. They were planning to keep watching her as she grew up. Detective Morrison nodded grimly. This particular network targeted families with young children specifically because they could maintain access for extended periods. Some victims had been under surveillance for years without knowing. They'd watched the children grow up, documenting everything. The investigation revealed the scope of the network was massive. The FBI, working with international law enforcement agencies, had identified over 3,000 compromised cameras in the United States alone. More than half were baby monitors. The rest were home security cameras, nanny cams, and other internet-connected devices that had been exploited. The methods the hackers used were sophisticated but exploited common vulnerabilities. Many people never changed the default passwords on their smart devices. Some manufacturers had security flaws in their software that weren't patched quickly enough. Users often failed to update firmware, leaving old vulnerabilities open. Many people didn't enable two-factor authentication. But what made Claire's case particularly chilling was that she had done everything right. She'd used a strong password, enabled two-factor authentication, and kept her firmware updated. The hackers had exploited a zero-day vulnerability, a security flaw that wasn't known to the manufacturer, to gain access. She'd been targeted not because she was careless, but because she was unlucky. The FBI launched a massive operation they called Operation Closed Circuit. Over the next 6 months, they made arrests across 17 states and in 12 foreign countries. The ringleader was a 34-year-old software engineer from Michigan named Thomas Watkins who'd been operating the network for years, personally profiting over $400,000 from the sale of footage and access credentials. When police raided Watkins' home, they found a sophisticated setup with multiple monitors showing live feeds from dozens of cameras, hard drives containing thousands of hours of recorded footage, and meticulous records of which families he'd compromised, how long he'd had access, and which content had been most popular with his customers. In one of his notebooks, police found an entry about Claire's monitor. Secured subject's camera February 12th. Mother is vigilant but trusting in technology. High-quality feed. Infant subject shows good long-term potential. Mother attractive, often visible during care routines. Shared access with users JM44 and BK_collector. Revenue to date, $1,247. Claire had been reduced to a line item in a predator's ledger. Her daughter's childhood, her privacy, her trust, all commodified and sold for profit. The trial was long and traumatic. Claire had to testify about the night she heard the voice, about the violation she felt, about the ongoing trauma of knowing that footage of her and her daughter was still out there, impossible to fully erase from the internet. She had to sit in a courtroom and listen to details about how the network operated, what had been done with footage of her family, and how many strangers had watched her most private moments. Thomas Watkins was convicted on 47 counts, including computer fraud, stalking, distribution of child exploitation material, and wire fraud. He was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, called it one of the most pervasive invasions of privacy in the digital age, and noted that the psychological harm to the victims would last far longer than any prison sentence. 17 other members of the network were also convicted and sentenced to varying terms. But for every person arrested, investigators knew there were dozens more who'd accessed the footage, downloaded it, shared it. The dark web forums were shut down, but the content had already spread. It was out there, forever, in the digital void. For Claire and David, life would never be the same. Claire developed severe anxiety and depression. She couldn't look at Olivia's nursery without feeling sick. They moved to a new house, hoping a fresh start would help, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She covered every camera lens in their home, laptop cameras, phone cameras, even the peephole in their front door. She refused to use any smart home devices, no matter how convenient they might be. David struggled with his own guilt. He'd been the one who'd insisted on getting the high-tech monitor, who'd wanted to be able to check on Olivia from his business trips. He'd chosen the specific model, set it up, created the account. The rational part of his mind knew the hackers were responsible, but the emotional part couldn't shake the feeling that he'd invited predators into his daughter's room. Olivia, thankfully, was too young to remember any of it. But Claire and David faced an impossible question. Would they tell her when she was older? Would they explain that somewhere out there, footage of her as an infant existed, created and distributed without her consent before she was even old enough to understand the concept of privacy? Their therapist, Dr. Patricia Wells, who specialized in technology-related trauma, told them she'd been seeing more and more cases like theirs. We're living in a transition period, she explained. We've rapidly adopted technology that allows us to see and hear everything, to be connected always, to monitor and record and store. But we haven't yet fully grasped the vulnerability that creates. Every camera is potentially someone else's eyes. Every microphone is potentially someone else's ears. And once that trust is violated, it's almost impossible to get it back. Claire became an advocate for smart device security and privacy rights. She testified before Congress about the need for stronger regulations on internet-connected devices, particularly those used to monitor children. She worked with cybersecurity firms to develop educational materials for parents about how to secure their smart home devices. She partnered with victims' rights organizations to push for stronger penalties for hacking and voyeurism crimes. But her advocacy came at a personal cost. Every time she told her story, she had to relive the violation. Every interview, every testimony, every presentation meant revisiting that night she heard the stranger's voice singing to her baby. Some days, she wasn't sure if spreading awareness was worth the personal toll it took on her mental health. "I do it because I don't want other parents to go through what we went through," Claire said in a 2020 interview. "I want them to understand that smart devices are incredibly convenient, but they come with risks. Real risks. You're not paranoid for being cautious. You're not overreacting if you choose simpler technology. And if something feels wrong, if you hear something, see something odd, have any sense that your device might be compromised, trust that instinct immediately." The FBI's investigation also revealed some disturbing statistics about the broader network. The average compromised camera had been accessed by 7 to 12 different users over its period of compromise. Footage of over 4,000 children had been distributed through the network. The youngest victim was only 4 days old. Some families had been monitored continuously for over 3 years without knowing. The network had been operating since 2015, meaning early victims' children were now in elementary school, with years of their childhood documented and distributed. Perhaps most disturbing was what investigators found regarding the psychological profile of the hackers and viewers. These weren't just pedophiles seeking explicit content of children. Many were people who described themselves as enjoying the reality of the footage, the authentic nature of watching real families in private moments. Some claimed they weren't doing anything wrong because they weren't physically present, weren't touching anyone, weren't even making contact. A forensic psychologist who worked on the case, Dr. Marcus Chin, explained this rationalization. Many of these offenders don't see themselves as predators because they're not physically present. They view themselves as passive observers, not considering that voyeurism is itself a violation. The digital distance creates a psychological buffer that allows them to engage in behavior they might not otherwise engage in. But make no mistake, the harm they cause is real and lasting. The case also sparked a national conversation about the trade-off between convenience and security in the smart home era. Tech ethicists pointed out that companies had rushed to market with internet-connected devices without adequately addressing security concerns. The focus had been on features and convenience. See your baby from anywhere. Get notifications when motion is detected. Store footage in the cloud. Without equivalent emphasis on encryption, authentication, and user education. One security researcher, speaking at a conference about the case, demonstrated just how easy it was to find unsecured cameras online. Using simple search engines designed for internet-connected devices, he showed a room full of horrified parents that thousands of baby monitors, security cameras, and nanny cams were openly accessible, requiring no password or authentication to view. Live feeds from nurseries, living rooms, and bedrooms were visible to anyone who knew where to look. The demonstration led to a wave of panic and action. Major retailers began removing the most vulnerable models from their shelves. Manufacturers issued mass security updates and recall notices. Some companies went out of business when it was revealed they'd knowingly sold devices with security flaws. Lawsuits proliferated as victims sought compensation for the trauma and violation they'd experienced. But for Claire, no amount of corporate accountability or legal action could undo what had happened. The footage was out there. The violation was permanent. And every day she had to live with the knowledge that somewhere, someone might be watching that footage, seeing her daughter's earliest days, seeing Claire in her most vulnerable moments as a new mother. The paranoia became all-consuming. Claire would wake up at night convinced she heard sounds in Olivia's room. She'd check on her daughter dozens of times per night, looking for anything out of place, any sign that they were being watched again. She inspected every smoke detector, every outlet, every decoration, looking for hidden cameras. She'd read articles about the latest spy technology and would see threats everywhere. In the neighbor's doorbell camera that might capture their front door, in the street security cameras on her drive to work, in the smartphones everyone carried that could be recording at any time. David tried to help, but he was struggling too. His career suffered as he became distracted and anxious. He'd be in meetings and suddenly feel the overwhelming urge to check on Claire and Olivia, to make sure they were safe, to confirm that their home wasn't compromised again. He started seeing a pattern everywhere. Every tech product was a potential vulnerability, every internet connection was a potential entry point for predators. Their marriage strained under the weight of the trauma. They snapped at each other over small things. They couldn't be intimate without thinking about cameras, about being watched, about violation. The joy had been stolen from their family, replaced by fear and hypervigilance. Dr. Wells warned them about the risk of this fear consuming their lives. "What happened to you was real and terrible," she told them. "But if you let it control every aspect of your life, if you let it destroy your peace and your ability to function, then the predators have won. They've taken not just your privacy but your ability to live freely. You have to find a way to acknowledge the risk without letting it paralyze you." It was advice that was easier to give than to follow. Slowly, painfully, with extensive therapy and support, Claire and David began to rebuild. They learned to live with uncertainty, to accept that complete security was impossible, to find a balance between caution and paranoia. They had another child, a son named Ethan, and faced the same questions about monitoring and safety. But this time they chose an analog audio monitor with no camera, no internet connection, no recording capability. It was less convenient, but it let them sleep at night. Olivia turned 7 years old in February 2025. She's a bright, happy child who loves art and soccer and has no idea that the worst violation of her life happened before she could form memories. Claire and David still haven't decided when or if they'll tell her. Their therapist suggests waiting until she's a teenager, old enough to understand privacy and technology and the darker corners of the internet. But Claire knows that conversation is inevitable. One day Olivia will learn what happened. One day she'll have to grapple with the knowledge that footage of her infancy exists somewhere in the digital darkness. And Claire dreads that day almost as much as she dreaded hearing that voice through the baby monitor 7 years ago. The case of Claire Henderson and the thousands of other victims of Operation Closed Circuit served as a wake-up call about the dark side of our connected world. It revealed how the very technology we use to feel safe and connected can be weaponized against us. It showed how the digital age has created new forms of violation that previous generations never had to fear. And it left families across the country asking themselves a question that has no easy answer. How do you protect your family in a world where any camera could be someone else's eyes, where any microphone could be someone else's ears, where privacy has become an illusion and safety is never guaranteed? For Claire, the answer remains elusive. But she keeps fighting, keeps speaking out, keeps hoping that by sharing her nightmare, she can prevent it from becoming someone else's reality. The baby monitor that started it all sits in an evidence box in an FBI facility, a piece of plastic and circuitry that represents something much darker. A window that was opened without permission, revealing the most intimate moments of a family's life to strangers who had no right to see them. It's just a monitor. Just technology. Just ones and zeros transmitted through the air. But to Claire Henderson, it will forever be the device that taught her a terrible truth. In the digital age, you're never truly alone. And the monsters aren't under the bed. They're behind the lens, watching, waiting, always there in ways you'll never fully know. Conclusion. 3 stories. 3 families. 3 different ways that the cameras meant to protect them revealed horrors they never could have imagined. The nanny cam that showed Sarah Mitchell the monster she'd invited into her home, hiding behind a smile and impeccable references. The Airbnb cameras that turned Marcus and Jen Chen's vacation into a nightmare of violation, their most intimate moments stolen and sold. And the baby monitor that taught Claire Henderson that the digital eyes we invite into our homes might belong to predators watching from the shadows of the internet. These aren't just stories. They're warnings. They're reminders that in our rush to embrace technology, to feel connected and secure, we've created new vulnerabilities that previous generations never had to fear. Every camera is a potential threat. Every smart device is a possible entry point. And the privacy we take for granted is far more fragile than we ever imagined. These stories have disturbed you good. They should. Because complacency is what these predators count on. They count on us trusting too easily, on us assuming we're safe, on us never looking up at that corner of the room or questioning why the smoke detector has a strange angle. So tonight, when you go to sleep, maybe take a moment to look around your home. Check your devices. Question your assumptions. Trust your instincts. And remember, just because you don't see anyone watching doesn't mean you're alone. If you found these stories as disturbing as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe to Dark Whispers. We delve into true horror stories every week. The kind that don't involve ghosts or demons but real monsters who walk among us. Share this video with someone who needs to hear these warnings. And drop a comment below telling me, have you ever felt like you were being watched? Have you ever found a hidden camera? Your stories matter, and this community is here to listen. Stay safe out there, everyone. Keep your eyes open. Question everything. And remember, the camera doesn't just watch over you. Sometimes, it watches you for someone else. Until next time, this is Dark Whispers, reminding you that the most terrifying stories are the ones that are true.